One of the things we've become familiar with the Reformation was the close association between religious reform and temporal authority. We saw this at the beginning with Martin Luther when he was so-called kidnapped after the Diet of Worms. We saw this in the incident of the Peasants' War when Luther sided with the princes against the peasants. We saw this in Zwingli's Zurich, where he worked very closely with the magistrates to bring about the reform of the church. But we've seen also that it was highly contested, that those who objected to this were named radicals, or had the name Anabaptist, that there were groups who were deeply suspicious of the relationship between power and religious reform. One of the most fascinating cases of this relationship took place in England. In the popular imagination, we think of the English Reformation, we think of Henry VIII. Perhaps we think of the Holbein portrait of him, the great statesman, the commanding imperial figure. And without doubt, his divorce, his search for an heir, the Act of Supremacy, the dissolution of the monasteries, transformed England. But Henry was no Protestant. He was, at heart, a Catholic, and much of the Catholic faith remained intact during his rule. One of the, I think, most perplexing questions, and one with which historians still struggle, is why he allowed his son Edward to be educated by Protestants. It was an extraordinary dynasty, the Tudors. We have Henry, followed by his son, and then one daughter, Mary, who is a staunch Catholic, and a second daughter, Elizabeth, who I want to say something about today, whose religious disposition, and attitudes continue to fascinate and allow us to see something of the complex and even confusing nature of the English Reformation. Such is the case that historians continue to debate exactly what happened and what was its true character. Elizabeth, seen here in her coronation portrait, was an extraordinary woman. The daughter of Anne Boleyn, who was executed. She had lived in extremely perilous circumstances for much of her youth. As a child and a student, she was brilliant, learning Latin and a humanist education from a young age. She wrote beautifully, spoke multiple languages. But her situation was very dangerous. She was a daughter, a woman, a girl, perhaps better said, of a queen who had been executed. She had been declared illegitimate. Her relationship with her sister, a devout Catholic, was deeply problematic. What would happen? On Henry's death, of course, son Edward came to the throne, and there was a Protestant Reformation. But Edward was only 10 years old, and he was a very sickly child. Under his advisors, men such as Somerset, a radical reform was undertaken, but time was short. Some of the great figures of the Continental Reformation came to England to bring this about, but nevertheless, Edward was dying. A new prayer book emerged in 1549, which gave shape to this new polity of a Protestant England, but it still had, in the eyes of many of the old traits of Catholicism. Replaced in 1552 by another prayer book, much of this the work of Thomas Cranmer, a towering figure of the English Church under Henry and Edward. But Edward dies. And who is to succeed? Well, an extremely unfortunate and botched plot tried to put another Protestant on the throne, Lady Jane Grey. But the crowds turned to Mary. And with Mary came the restoration of Catholicism. Mary's life was in many respects a tragic one. She too sought to have a child. She married Philip, King of Spain, a deeply unpopular marriage because many thought that it would make England subservient to Spain. She tried in many ways, to restore Catholicism because most of the country still was Catholic. And in some respects, she was highly successful. But she didn't, for instance, try to bring back monasticism. But she too was ill and died, leaving Elizabeth. What had Elizabeth's place been under Mary? Again, extremely precarious. She was in a very dangerous situation and very close to losing her life. She had, to some degree, outwardly conformed, but by disposition, when she assumed the throne, was a Protestant. Elizabeth inherited an England that was deeply divided. There were Protestants, probably many more Catholics. The country was destitute. It had suffered terrible depredations. She had a country or a kingdom that needed to be held together. It was on the verge of collapse or of war. The first thing Elizabeth does is to bring about, through her advisors and leaders, men such as Lord Burleigh, William Cecil, is to bring about an arrangement for the Reformation. The Elizabethan settlement, 1558, 1559, just as she comes to the throne. What does it do? Well, befitting Her Majesty, she restores the supremacy, the act of supremacy. She is the head of the church. The Pope is no longer, as under Mary. The monarch is restored to the place that her father had envisaged so dramatically all those years ago. But also recognizing that there was a complex relationship with the country that needed to be dealt with very carefully. Elizabeth sought, with her advisors, to create a situation called the Act of Uniformity, which required people to attend church and worship by the Book of Common Prayer here in a 1559 edition. And if they did not attend, they were fined. So what was required in England under this arrangement with Elizabeth was outward conformity to the forms of worship without trying to control what people or police what people actually believed. This was, I think, a brilliant solution to an extraordinarily complicated and difficult situation in a country that was so religiously divided. Now, nevertheless, there were many Catholics who opposed her, and many of those Catholics were extremely influential. Much of the population still had strong Catholic sentiments. And there were others, many of whom had been exiles during Mary's reign, had gone to places like Geneva and Zurich, where they had been on the continent, studied Reformed theology, worked and served and preached in Reformed churches, translated the Bible, become the great case of the Geneva Bible in England, 1560. all these people came back now with a Protestant queen with great expectation that there would now be a Protestant England. This would be the light in Europe of the new faith of a Reformed church. So Elizabeth found herself trying to deal with radically different expectations. The theology of those who came back from the continent in some ways dominated, set the theological theme of Elizabeth's church. The 39 Articles of 1563 are largely reformed in orientation. This becomes the crucial theological expression of the Elizabethan church. But Elizabeth is determined to be no servant of Geneva. I had mentioned before the story of John Knox's 1558 tract against the monstrous regiment of women, which Elizabeth had assumed Calvin had had a hand in, and was deeply offended and enraged about Geneva. Elizabeth was to be no one's servant. And her own religious views continue to perplex. She didn't particularly enjoy sermons. She famously or infamously, depending on people's views, kept a crucifix in her chapel. She had no problem with the old clerical vestments and titles. Yet in other ways, doctrinally, she seemed to be entirely conventional in her Protestantism. What sort of faith she maintained was really her own, and as she was in so many ways, she kept people guessing as to what she was thinking and what she intended to do. But Elizabeth presided over a church and a kingdom for 44 years, in which she was remarkably able to keep both a degree of religious peace and political stability. If one thinks about the Armada and any number of other events, her excommunication by the papacy in 1570, there were no end of attacks from the outside, and her own involvement in events on the continent. But nevertheless, there was a degree of stability at home that she was able to preserve, and central to that was a religious policy that was based on a degree of moderation, looking only to outward conformity. Francis Bacon famously said to her that Elizabeth did not want to make windows into men's souls, that what one did outwardly was all that would be observed. Nevertheless, she faced serious challenges. She faced the challenges of Catholic revolt. She would face the presence of Jesuits within England, Catholic martyrs such as Edmund Campion, and also those who believed that England had an unfinished Reformation. Those people are often referred to as Puritans, a very difficult term, one that doesn't emerge until later. But for the most part, they did not wish to conform entirely to Elizabeth's model because they believed that it still retained too much of the old papal religion. The Reformation had not been completed. The Word of God was not being fully proclaimed, as it is here from this image of Puritan preaching. The reform of morals. The Puritans were not one type of person or exactly one line of thought. They encompassed a whole range of views. But I think it's fair to say that what distinguished most of them was a deep dissatisfaction with the present situation and a burning desire to reform God's church, against the form that was expressed in its established expression in the church. So this is the world of Elizabeth's church. Catholicism, the Puritans, and those who upheld its structure. Its theology was largely reformed in orientation, but that instability that ultimately arose from it would take the form extraordinary events of the 17th century. And we cannot, if we go back to Henry and through Elizabeth, we cannot think about these events without going forward to the tumultuous times of Cromwell and the revolution to come.